Now, may I ask you a final question? What was the reaction of the profession, and especially the American economists, to the return of the master? Do they have some sense, or do they still think that that nothing changes? I mean, actually, there is no reason for them to so to speak, make a, what do you say, when you ask to pardon after a sin, they don't have to condone their sins.
Well, I think it depends on which side of the political divide. And Krugman gave it an enthusiastic reception. Yeah. Stiglitz has been enthusiastic. And some other economists have also been very, but then the more conservative ones have not been. They say Keynes is irrelevant. In fact, Mankiw wrote quite a hostile review in which he said that Lucas was much superior to Keynes and Keynes was simply irrelevant, and that I was irrelevant because I tried to bring Keynes back. What you said at the beginning of your questioning was very important. Basically, the Keynesian revolution was swept aside in the 1980s by Reaganism, Thatcherism, and all these protective measures which were put in place to prevent markets rampaging were swept aside. Yeah. And the new doctrine was markets are always right. You had efficient financial market, the hypothesis, which says that securities and risks are always correctly priced. Yeah. And you had rational expectations, which suggests that agents always utilize up-to-the-minute information to price shares, and therefore they must be priced relative to the information correctly always. And so all that whole Keynesian sort of exploration of the world of uncertainty, of fears, of optimism and pessimism, was sort of set aside as sort of, anecdotal and not something that could be modeled correctly. I think helping the revival of the Valrasian notion of economics was mathematics, was crucially important. Yeah. And models were built which were mathematically tractable rather than realistic.
Yeah.
And so
that's the problem with mathematics.
Yeah, and you had a Platonic, world created by economists, which made very strong assumptions about competition, about information, about completeness of markets, which had no relation actually at all to the actual world. But they then said, well, this is the only way of doing economics, because otherwise it ceases to be a proper science. You know, economists have suffered terribly from physics envy. They want to be like physicists, and they're constantly frustrated by human beings.
You mentioned that economics should go back into being a moral science, not a physical, not a natural science. It's a moral science. And Keynes was really insisted very much on this very point.
Yeah. I think Keynes used moral in two ways. First of all, in the way we use social science, which is it's about society, not about disconnected atoms. And secondly, that you should ask the question, well, what is the end of economic growth? I mean, what's it for? Yeah. And that was his second use of the word moral, that you have an end, which is to enable people to live well in a moral sense, and therefore not grow, asking, well, why should you do this? So he understood the moral imperatives of growth because of its effect in relieving poverty, but he also said that at some point you'd expect growth to stop and people to start enjoying life more. Otherwise, it's all for nothing.
But you made a very important point, novel to me yesterday, in your lecture, Magister, on which I would like to end up this conversation of ours. You made a point. You said, well, Keynes, as we know, did reason in the short period, so it took many things for granted, so to speak, like the state of technology, like distribution of incomes between rich and poor, or between wage earners and profit earners. But you said something very important yesterday to me. He said, perhaps in a longer view, we should take into account the relationship between growth and the distribution of income. Because given the fact that, so to speak, poor people tend to spend more than rich people, if you alter the distribution of income, if I understood correctly what you said yesterday, if you alter the distribution of income in favor of rich people, quote unquote, and against poor people, you are going to change the propensity to consume, and therefore the inducement to invest, and therefore the growth. So we should be looking serious, you say, into the problems which in the last 20 years have grown of maldistribution of income within countries and within countries. Can you say something on this?
Yeah,
it's very new.
It's an old tradition. Of course, it goes back to Ricardo. It goes back to Marx. It goes back, and then you have this underconsumptionist view, which Keynes sympathized with, by the way, of Hobson, which influenced Lenin in a different, you know. So there's a whole left-wing critique of capitalism for producing unequal distribution of income, which they couldn't quite connect up with macro consequences. And Keynes also, as you said, took distribution. He said there would be a problem of effective demand, whatever the income distribution. But he also said it would be much less of a problem if there was a broad base for consumption, because in the end it's consumption that drives investment. And if the mass of the people don't have enough power to buy, then, and money is concentrated in a very small segment of the population, then investment tends to become speculation, because there's not enough demand for goods and services. So the corporate profits which pile up are expended in speculative activities, and I think there's been a lot of evidence for that in the run up to the recent depression. He also thought of it as a power problem. I mean, if too much wealth is concentrated in too few hands, these are the people who control the system, and democracy doesn't get a look in. And he was aware of that, he was conscious of that, but he said, look, that's not the problem now in 1936. It will become the problem as we go forward and try to construct a new political economy. And so there's maybe disappointingly little about this. But he did say at the end of the general theory, I mean, one of the two problems of the capitalist system is its inequitable distribution of income.
So do you think that the problem of nowadays has been made more serious by the maldistribution of income?
Absolutely.
Which took place in the last 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the way the Keynesian economy worked in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a much more equal distribution of income. You know, the gap between average worker and chief executive in America in the 1960s was about 80, I think. And that's quite large. But now it's between 1 and 5,000 or something like this. I mean, it's widened enormously, and that has been as a direct result of the withdrawal of the welfare state benefits, the outsourcing of production to very, very cheap sources, which has greatly restored the profit rate. I mean, in a way, I'm tempted to say with Marx that outsourcing was the modern equivalent of creating a reserve army of unemployed in order on a global scale. On a global scale. Of course, they're not unemployed, but they work very, very cheaply. And it takes one back into the discussion of Lenin and, you know, why the center exploits the periphery in order to keep up the rate of profit. All that discussion is back on the agenda, I think. It has to be discussed in modern terms, but there it is. You can't just sort of close your eyes to it. And that raises the issue of globalization, the future of globalization, and so on.
Okay, that will be...